welcome to a brief presentation on Viking voyages in the Atlantic. So what we'll be discussing today is what the Norsemen did in the Atlantic, how they discovered and explored Iceland, Greenland, and North America. All right, so let's start a bit with a terminological problem. So that will concern the use of the word Viking. So if you want to be very, very accurate, Viking, generally speaking, means the mariners, so the sailors, the ones embarking on journeys with the purpose first and foremost of raiding, but then there is also the exploration and trading component. So it was not really something very well planned ahead. It had to do a lot with chances and opportunity as well. However, the term is still used in scholarship nowadays to refer to the whole of the people, so to the Scandinavians between roughly the 8th and 11th century. So not only the raiders and traders, but also the farmers, the ones who stayed at home. So the more correct term for that would be the Norse, or the Norse speaking, or the Northmen, something like that. But we weren't really able to give it up completely. However, for this presentation, the term Viking is fully appropriate because we are going to talk a lot about exploration and discovery. So first of all, what made the Norse so capable of undergoing such extensive journeys? Well, first and foremost, we're dealing with very advanced shipbuilding techniques. The ship of the Vikings were constructed primarily of oak and clinker built, using iron rivets and tarred animal hair for caulking. And the flexibility of the ship was increased by lashing the strakes below the waterline to the frames with spruce root lashings. And then they would also use a removable pole or tacking boom, which helped with sailing against the wind. The voyages were made with the so-called knør type of ship, or the hovskip. We have wrecks for that found in the Roskilde Fjord, the Skuldeløv ship. So if you'd visit Denmark, you should go to the Viking Ship Museum. It's located in Roskilde, and then you're going to see the remains of these ships. They also had navigational skills, so they could determine latitudes. It is possible that they even used tables, which gave the sun's midday latitude, and they might have also used simple instruments like marked sticks or observations of the pole star. We actually have some archaeological object, or at least one archaeological object that is a good fit for that. The ability to maintain a correct latitude would have been crucial for the discoveries we're discussing, especially in the stormy North Atlantic. And then there is also the possibility that they would have used the light polarizing qualities of calcite, or the so-called sunstone, to observe the sun even when it was hidden from view. If you want to know more about the topic, I actually have a separate video on that, the navigation of the Vikings, so you can just go to my YouTube channel and watch that later. At any rate, it is important to notice that they were very familiar with a lot of concepts, such as the continuous land ring, which would have provided a framework for navigation, and they would have also used all kinds of landmarks in order to find their way. So in that sense, they were really experienced and very intrepid. On their way to Iceland, the first stop would have been the Faroe Islands. The Norse also colonized the Faroe Islands. The islands would not have been empty. There is strong evidence that Irish monks were present here before the Vikings. We're talking about roughly 700 AD, and they would have lived there, at least according to Dicuil, until 820. So we need the writings of this monk Dicuil to describe the islands before the Viking Age. At any rate, the Vikings seem to have reached the islands around 820. We have a name here as well, Grim Kamban. He is considered to be the first Norse settler in the Faroe Islands, and it is very possible that he and his followers started dispossessing the Irish monks. His nickname also suggests that he might have come via Ireland or the Hebrides, and might have even been Christian. So followers, pirates, followed him, and they quickly gained control of the islands. So, well, there is this claim of Dickwill that the islands became empty of the monks. However, some of their influence might have remained in the lore or the folklore, referring to the Faroe Islands and later on to Iceland. And from the Faroe Islands, the Norsemen traveled to Iceland. So it would have been a very important stopping point. Now, about Iceland, we have two very important written sources about the settlement of Iceland. These sources would be the Landnoma book, the Book of Settlements, and the Islendinga book, the Book of the Icelanders. Here you can find all kinds of information regarding how Iceland was discovered and settled. But we also have, more or less confirmation from the archaeological data. So even if these stories do not tell in detail quite accurately what happened, you would still find the let's say the framework to be confirmed by archaeology. For example, in the 9th century, we have the tephra, so the layer of volcanic ash, confirming that the colonization of Iceland would have actually happened in the late 800s, so roughly 870. Now, according to the Book of Settlements, to Landnoma book, the first settler to come to Iceland was someone called Nadot. He is described as being a Viking and as having reached Iceland in the year 830. He was sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands when he was blown off course. He did explore the island a bit. He was searching for communities, and he did not find any evidence of human habitation. He did try to establish a settlement on the east coast of present-day Reyðarfjörður, but he left eventually. And it is said that he gave the island its first name, Snowland. After Nadot, we have another name, Gardar Svavarsson. He would have come from Sweden, actually, and he might have also been blown off course some 30 years later. It is told that he circumnavigated the landmass and determined it was an island, and he also tried to establish a small settlement around the modern-day town of Húsavík, so in the north. Gardar then tried to rename the island as the island of Gardar, and then he sailed back home. However, one of his men did stay behind with a slave, and it is said that these might have been the first permanent settlers of Iceland. The third Scandinavian explorer to Iceland was Flóki Vilgerðarson. So Gardar had already established that we're dealing with a large island and it was worth establishing a settlement there. He was unsure of the precise location, however, and so brought along some ravens with him to help him, or at least that's what the Book of Settlements tell us. So he released the first, but it would not leave the ship, and then the second one flew away and then swiftly returned, and then the third raven flew off and led them safely to land. Probable Christian influence here, if you consider the tale of Noah. At any rate, we are dealing with, let's say, semi-historical accounts. The Book of Settlements then goes on into detail on the expedition of the man who is considered to be the first historical settler of Iceland, Ingólfur Arnarsson. Ingólfur and his foster brother Hjörleifur had initiated a blood feud in Norway, and that is why they were forced to leave for another place, and in this case, Iceland. It is also told that there would have been the tradition of throwing your high seat pillars into the sea. So these would have been the pillars of your chair in the mead hall. And then wherever they floated, they washed up the shore. That would be a place favorable for the settlement. It is also told that Hjörleifur had no regard for this custom. He ignored it completely. He just landed somewhere. He named Hjörleifur's head a promontory, and in the same time Ingólfur actually respected this tradition, and he built a temporary shelter where he arrived, and he sent his slaves out to search for the place where his pillars had washed up, because he did not want to stay where he landed initially, but he really wanted to find these pillars. Something very tragic happened at Hjörleifur settlement. One of the sleighs he took from Ireland concocted a plan, and following this plan, the slaves actually killed Hjörleifur, and they took all his men and women and went out into the woods and eventually into the Westman Islands. Now, Ingólfur's slaves eventually find out about this, and they report to him, and Ingólfur decides to go and find them and to avenge his foster brother, which he does, and eventually they also find the pillars, and so a permanent community is founded on the spot of the modern day city of Reykjavik, and this happens in 874. Generally speaking, the time period between 870 and 930 is called the Age of Settlement. Until the end of this period, all the available land would have been claimed, and then we have the Age of Commonwealth, or the Age of the Sagas. This is the period where most of the family sagas of the Icelanders take place, and lately, last but not least, we have the Age of the Sturlungar. This would mean the, let's say, devolution of the society the settlers built, and this culminates with the Commonwealth losing its independence in the favor of the Norwegian crown. So the settlers here were very much acting out of self-interest. They were seizing the opportunity to settle new land, especially because this new land would have not had any other people on it, with the exception of, again, like in the case of the Faroe Islands, a couple of Irish monks who then left. So it really was a free environment, so a possibility to develop communities there, despite the fact that we're dealing with quite a hostile climate and environment. They carried a lot with them, most of them, and this is also confirmed by recent genetic studies. Most of them would have come from Norway, off the western coast of Norway, but they also had quite an important Celtic population with them, most probably slaves. They came on merchant ships, so the Knurr I mentioned earlier, and these were very large ships. They could carry even 30 tons of cargo, and they brought with them animals as well, so horses and cattle and sheep and whatever else they needed. What they managed to found here in Iceland is what can be regarded decentralized, stratified community with pre-state features and some stately institutions, but at any rate, it would have been something very different than what was going on the continent. They were speakers of West Old Norse, and they actually named this language the Dönsk Tongu, which is a very interesting name because it literally means the Danish tongue. It's difficult to say why they named it that, but we are referring to Old Norse, and most of the sources we have on actually anything happening in either in Iceland or in Scandinavia is written in Old West Norse or Old Icelandic. Who led these communities? Well, the communities were led by chieftains, the so-called Goðar, and the Goðar also had a very interesting position because they were not really warrior chiefs, they were political leaders. There was no military here, and that meant that there was no privileged control over a region's surplus production either. So they did not really have all the means necessary in order to control a community, and they did not tend to big community work such as irrigation systems or something like that. But they did have the ability to compel farmers to do their bidding, at least to a certain extent. So I think the best way to understand them is as leaders of particular interest groups. Personal alliances were very important here, and they did hold, let's say, an official position, an office, which was called the Goðorð. The Goðorð was something that could have been purchased, it could have been rented as well, or even received as a gift. And if you look at the term Goði, it is very probable that it also had a religious function. So it was really a combination between being a political leader and a religious leader. And this connotation was even preserved after the Christianization of Iceland in the year 1000, because the chieftains were the ones who made sure that churches were built close to them on their lands, and they would also use the power of the church, for example, to instill taxation on the farmers. So it was really a very strong connection between the political and religious function. Now, the sources that give us a lot of information, and I don't mean here historical information, but I mean information about mentalities and about how society would have worked, are the Icelandic sagas, in particular the so-called family saga. So the Icelandic sagas can be divided into several groups. Besides the family sagas, we also have the legendary sagas and the Sturlunga sagas, bishop sagas, and so on and so forth. But the family sagas really refer to this period between the settlement and the 13th century. So we can use them not really from a historical point of view, but from a sociological point of view, anthropological point of view. It is also the, let's say, foundation myth that is being concocted here in these sagas. So they're not that historical, but they're very important as a vehicle of social memory and collective identity. So it's not factual history, it's just a social recollection of the way people would have organized themselves in these centuries. And we have a lot of details about the doings of those aspiring to power, for example, a lot of episodes involving feuding, involving legal processes, accusations, but also quite a lot of supernatural and paranormal events, such as hauntings and sorcery, and so on. So they're also quite entertaining, besides what they can offer us from an anthropological point of view. Now, like I said, Iceland was not really a hospitable place to be. They would have been confronted with a lot of challenges. The climate on the coast is actually not that harsh. The Gulf Stream is responsible for that, but the island is between two currents, the North Atlantic Drift and the East Greenland Polar Current, and this gives quite an unstable weather. And yes, of course, the landscape is dotted with lava fields and all kinds of remains of lava events from the past. The area that you can cultivate is not really that large. The center of the island cannot be inhabited. So definitely a lot of challenges here, especially in terms of how to divide these resources. The settlers, like I said, brought the animals. Sheep farming with the passage of time became the most important. At the beginning, it was actually cattle farming, but then in the meantime, sheep farming became more vital than that. And the horses also carried quite a deep significance. They were essential when traveling, especially, and they also remained Scandinavian. So unlike what happened on the continent, where in the High Middle Ages there was this tendency of breeding Scandinavian horses with other breeds of horses, such as Arabic ones. In Iceland, they stayed the same, and they are still the same. So the horses you can see now in Iceland, they're exactly the same as would have been those brought by Icelanders. It's a very pure breed, the Icelandic horse, and it is smaller, but very, very sturdy and very reliable. Now, Icelanders organized themselves on isolated farmsteads with hay fields and meadows. Access to them was very important, and they essentially became a pastoral people. Households needed pastures. They needed control over these pastures to provide fodder and keep a minimum of livestock, and also feed your dependents on the farm. So we can say that from the very beginning, Iceland was a society organized around private property, and the legal system also played a part in maintaining it. However, it lacked the formal institutions to protect these properties. There was no institution to enforce these laws, so people had to be able to do that themselves. They had to adapt really quickly. They had to organize themselves to develop strategies of pastoralism and hunter-gathering as well. You can find a lot of references about how they did that. For example, there is chapter 29 in Egil Saga, where Skallagrim, who's Egil's father, is described as doing all these activities from farming sheep and cattle to exploring whales that were adrift that came adrift on the shore, and also going for egg hunting, wild birds. So essentially anything you could have done to ensure your subsistence, you would have done. This was very important because at the beginning the settlement was financed by quite a lot of wealth. This would have been acquired through trade and raiding, but after 930, there would have been quite the decrease in capital, and that would have meant that you really needed to adapt, and really fast. There is evidence that they managed to do that. A lot of the farms actually display continuity. So between the 10th century and the 19th century, 9th century of continuity is an accomplishment. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't have been drastic changes in societal organizations and so on, but it does show that these people were actually very capable of surviving. Survival came to be particularly difficult after the island started losing its wood. Erosion is something that happened during the Viking Age quite a lot. We have a lot of references in the Book of Settlements and also in some sagas that the island would have been covered by woodland, at least about I think more than 30%. There would have been birch and willow and shrubs and so on, but in order to clear the land and to produce farmland, so for your animals, the technique they used was to burn the trees for clearing. And this is something you can also retrieve archaeologically from a site such as the Mossfell Valley, where an archaeological project has been ongoing for a couple of years. So the lack of wood would have been quite the problem. You couldn't fence with wood, so that meant you needed to find other solutions, such as building turf walls to enclose manure fields and so on. And as a means to build your house, you would have built sod homes with very thick walls. You would have had timber as well, but that would have come from driftwood, and it's not always the most reliable. At any rate, the turf house was the most important unit of the time. It was the central point of everyday life, and it was quite similar to what we find on the Scandinavian peninsula, but the difference is that in the Middle Ages, Scandinavians started to build these constructions more and more out of wood, whereas Icelanders stuck to turf, not because they wanted to, but because it was the only thing they could do. These halls were called skáli in Icelandic, and they would have been these very long structures. They would have been wider in the middle, with the outside walls being built first, and then you would build the wooden frame, and finally the roof. If done properly and under good conditions, these houses could have lasted up to 100 years. The difference was made by maintenance. There was a problem with grass growing over the lower outside walls, so they would essentially melt in the landscape, some of them, and animals would have also grazed on their roofs. for example. And yeah, we do have a lot of archaeological records about that, not only written records, for example, Grannastad in Eyjafjord, Hofstad in Mývatn, so in the north, and also the Stöng farm. The archaeology has revealed objects such as soapstone bowls, and also remains of benches and long fires that would have taken place in the middle of the room. Now, you could have incorporated more internal timber work, and if you were capable of doing that, that would have meant a little more comfort. You would have also been capable of building passage walls with rooms, different types of rooms, and archaeologically, latrines also seem to have been built, at least in the more prosperous farms, and also saunas. At Stöng, for example, here we do have an example of a very prosperous farm. It was quite well preserved under the ashes of Hekla, which erupted in 1114. And here you can see an entrance room, a large entrance room with a closet for storing smoked fish. So yeah, quite advanced. And then evidence for cooking on the long fire. But at the same time, you would have also had a steep pitch of the roof that would have allowed for smoke to rise. So it wouldn't have been as smoky inside as in other houses. And there's also evidence for a protected sleeping place for the husbondi, so for the leader of the household, and for the lady of the house as well. So let's look a little bit at the political system, because this is very interesting. It's quite a unique case in European history. Independent small communities came to being. They would have been led by the so-called Godar. And in 930, the General Assembly was established, the Althing of Thingvellir. This would have united society under one law. Iceland did not have many offices. One of them, so the most important one, was that of law speaker. So the law speaker would have proclaimed the law at the Althing. Otherwise, the Icelandic Free State was without a king. It was without a central executive power. The legislative and judicial power belonged together to the chieftains, to the Godar, who are dependent on their adherents. The Thingmen, and the Thingmen would have been free farmers, so-called Bænder. About the legal system, again, the Landnámabók offers us a couple of interesting pieces of information. It is mentioned that Ulfjotr was sent to Norway to create a legal code for Iceland, and he adapted the Gulathing law of Norway. The country was then divided into quarters after 960, and quarter courts were established. Sentencing occurred at the Althing and the regional spring assemblies. So essentially, the Icelandic society consisted of free farmers who owned the land and the farm where they lived, and they would have worked together with the farmhands and the wives and children and everyone else. Strife and violence would have increased in the 12th century because we are living in a time where power became concentrated in fewer hands, and this would have led to internal feuds, and the ones profiting of the situation would have been the Norwegians. The Norwegian king Håkon Håkonason used the political situation to gain sovereignty over Iceland, so Iceland loses its independence in 1262, and the Icelanders become subjects of the Norwegian crown. Also, a very important event is the Christianization. Christianity comes to Iceland, and it is decided in the year 1000 that the whole island becomes Christian. Actually, the pagan law speaker Þorgeir Þorgeirsson decides that, and it was rather for practical reasons in order to maintain peace. So the structure of Viking Age Iceland was unique in the sense that we have this mix between stateless and state-like feature. It was what Jesse Byock deems a headless polity because it lacked a regional military leader, kings as well, so it operated very much without official hierarchies. But this is also not to say that it was egalitarian, because it was not. We have the chieftains, the Godar, the political leaders, but their power would have been built very differently. They had limited formal authority to police, and they did not really have repressive means either. So they had to rely on a lot on negotiation, on arbitration, on convincing. So your capability as a leader to gather people around you, and this means that the free landholding farmers, or the binder, would have also had significant power, and it was, let's say, a consensus-based leadership. So chieftains operated by gaining consensus, compromising among their followers, and reciprocity was fundamental here. So mutual obligation between the chieftains and their followers. But we have this Althing, this assembly, the central legislature, the National Assembly of Freemen, and they would have operated through a socio-political system in which the elite, the Godar, were not linked by a formal hierarchy, and it helped a little bit with the centralization to counter regional fragmentation. So in this sense, we can say that we do have some form of unification and a countrywide judicial and legal system, but then the concrete operation of law was connected to advocacy, to friendships, to kinship ties, and this would have shaped social behavior. So despite what the sagas tell us about all these feuds, largely speaking, it would not have been that violent of a society, but of course the sagas prefer to detail the entertaining episodes. Social stratification in comparison to the rest of Europe was also limited. Differences did exist between landowners and landless people, as well as between freemen and slaves. But social differentiation was relatively fluid, with very few rigid barriers from the 10th to 12th century. We can also say that we're dealing with some sort of system of checks and balances aimed to limit the power of individual chieftains. So farmers could grant authority to the chieftains, but at the same time, dissatisfied farmers could shift their allegiance to another leader. So essentially, the cultural focus of Iceland would have been on law, and disorder was avoided through legalistic solutions, arbitration, court cases, and so on. Because coercive power was very much privatized, Icelanders did not pay taxes for the upkeep of state institutions and enforcement until the sheep tax was introduced near the end of the Free State, and then we also have the church tax about in the same period. Despite not being a democratic system, at least in our modern understanding, Iceland does exhibit some proto-democratic tendencies, so to speak. The society that emerged was largely based on a system of decentralized self-government that functioned very much through personal relationships between leaders and followers. The Viking Age settlers established local assemblies or things, which expanded to include the interests of landed free farmers, and this transformed the Scandinavian decision-making body into an Icelandic system without overlords. Now, initially, there were approximately 36 chieftaincies, but the number of chieftains could have been higher because the office could have been held by 2 or more individuals. So the number was slightly different. And then we have some constitutional reforms around 965. As part of this constitutional reform, the number was limited to 39. And in addition to that, 9 men were given the title of Godi, but their duties were mostly limited to participation in the legislative and political functions of the Althing. So this meant that the actual number of chieftains was a little more than the number of chieftaincies. The division into quarters is fulfilled, so to speak, in 965, after Iceland is divided into 4 quarters. A 13th springtime assembly was added in the northern quarter. That was because it was the most populous one, and then you needed to maintain a balance of power among the quarters at the Althing. So the Gothi title was conferred upon 3 new chieftains, each from the eastern, western, and southern quarters. And the conclusion to that is that the total number of Gothar would have been 48. By the 30th century, the number of chieftains would have diminished and the power of the remaining leaders would have grown. Essentially, 6 large families came to monopolize the control and ownership of many of the original chieftaincies. And these men were called in literature the big chieftains, the Stórgoðar. Now, there were also other forms of organization, such as the Hreppar. Hreppar were community units composed of a minimum of 20 farmers, and these geographically defined associations of landowners would have been independent of the Gothar. But generally speaking, the main organization would have been the one made up of the Binder and the Gothar. So, as you can see, quite the unique organization, and it functioned more or less. The main problem here would have been your ability to actually enforce the law, and most feuds that are detailed in the sagas stem from this particular aspect, as well as from how you interpret the law, or what kind of friendships you cement in order to influence the law. After having looked at how Iceland functioned, let's continue our journey with Greenland. Now, the Norse settlement of Greenland represents one very, very ambitious colonial endeavor of the Viking Age. This was established by Eric the Red in the late 10th century, and the Norse communities did manage to survive for about 500 years, facing a lot of hardships, economic isolation, environmental conditions, and unfortunately, before the 15th century, or let's say the beginning of the 16th century, they actually disappeared. Greenland was likely spotted before the arrival of Eric the Red. The first recorded mention of land beyond Iceland actually comes from someone else, from someone called Gunnbjörn Ulfkráksson. He would have been a Norwegian sailor who was blown off course between Norway and Iceland sometime between 900 and 930. And he reported seeing some rocky outcrops that later carry his name off Greenland's east coast. The sighting did not lead to immediate exploration, but it did set a precedent for later Norse curiosity. The first serious attempt to explore Greenland was undertaken by Snæbjörn Galti, an Icelandic chieftain, around 978. And according to later sources, he would have sailed westward with a crew of Icelanders hoping to claim land in Greenland, but the expedition ended in failure and internal conflict, leading to his death. So the true discovery and colonization of Greenland was in fact led by Eiríkur Ráði Thorvaldsson, so Eric the Red, the Norwegian who had previously settled in Iceland, but he had been involved in a violent feud and was banished from Iceland for 3 years. So this would have forced him to seek new lands. Around 982, he sailed westward, following rumors of land sites beyond the sea, and over the next 3 years, he explored Greenland's southwestern coast. He actually sailed quite deep into the fjords and identified areas suitable for the settlement. Then he came back to Iceland and he tried to recruit some followers, and he deliberately named the land Greenland, reasoning that a pleasant name would attract more settlers. And this strategy actually worked. In 986, he led a fleet of 25 ships filled with settlers, livestock, and supplies. Unfortunately, only 14 ships arrived, while the others were lost to the storms. They established themselves in southwestern Greenland, focusing on the more fertile fjordlands, where the climate, although harsh, was mild enough to actually support farming. He claimed the best land for himself, of course, at Eriksfjord. That would be the modern Tununjarvik, and he established Brattahlid, modern Kasjarsuk, as his personal estate. Two main settlements developed: the eastern settlement, which, as you can see on the map, it was actually in the south, the Östrisbygd, and then the western settlement, the Vestribygd. The eastern one was the largest, most prosperous. It housed approximately between 2,000 and 5,000 people at its peak, and it contained about 200 farms spreading across multiple fjords, with Brattahlid as the political center. Another major site would have been Gardar. Gardar also became a religious hub. It hosted a bishopric and a cathedral. And on the other hand, Kvalsøy was home to Greenland's best preserved Norse church, where the last recorded event took place. And I'm talking here about a wedding from the year 1408. The western settlement was much smaller. It only had about 90 farms and 4 churches, and it was also confronted with a harsher climate. It was more isolated, and it made survival significantly more difficult. The western settlement was also sustained for a couple of centuries, but it was the first one to collapse. Now, there are some scholars and archaeologists proposing the existence of a middle settlement, the Midbygd, consisting of about 20 farms, but this has yet to be confirmed. The Norse would have lived in turf houses as well. In Greenland, similar to those in Iceland, and they were designed to insulate against the harsh winters. Subsistence farming and animal husbandry, again, they would have raised cattle and sheep and goats, heavily relying on milk and cheese, but also on meat. Horses were also vital, mainly for transport, not for food. Unfortunately, due to the very short growing season, agriculture was essentially limited to barley and hay. Farming was much more viable in the eastern settlement. The climate was slightly warmer, and the fjords offered some shelter from the Arctic winds. The natural resources of Greenland being so limited, that meant that hunting and fishing would have played a crucial role. So the Norse would have hunted seals. Walrus ivory became a key export. It was highly valued in medieval Europe for decorative objects, for relics and chess pieces, and other animals included caribou, so the reindeer, as well as polar bears, who would have actually also been sometimes exported to European courts as exotic gifts. Trading was essential for the Norse. Greenland lacked iron, timber, and grain. So the settlers would export ivory as well as tusks, falcons, seal skins, and in return they imported essential supplies such as iron tools, weapons, timber for shipbuilding, and grain for bread. So Greenland's economic survival very much depended on regular trade with Norway and Iceland. But the remote location made it increasingly unreliable over time. So despite the initial success, the Norse faced mounting challenges that ultimately led to their disappearance. One of the greatest threats was climate change. Around the year 1300, the onset of the Little Ice Age caused temperatures to drop, leading to shorter growing seasons, increased sea ice, and harsher storms. The Norse became, as a consequence, increasingly vulnerable to food shortages due to famine. And the colder climate also made sea travel much more dangerous. Another significant factor would have been the conflict with the Inuit. The Thule Inuit were the ancestors of modern Greenlandic Inuits, and they began migrating southward in the 13th century. They would have brought with them superior hunting techniques and that would have allowed them to thrive in Greenland's extreme environment. That, however, does not mean that the Norse did not try to adapt. As a matter of fact, a recent study of human skeletal remains from both the eastern and western settlements showed that they quickly adopted a new diet. So over time, The idea is that the food we eat leaves a chemical stamp on our bones, and marine-based diets mark us with different ratios of certain chemical elements than terrestrial foods do. So that allowed researchers based in Scandinavia and Scotland to analyze about 100 individuals from the earliest period of settlement to the latest, and most of the seafood consisted of seals. That was the conclusion of the study. However, the Norse seem to have limited their hunting of the local harbor seal, a species that raised its young on the beaches, making it easy prey. Instead, they pursued the more abundant but also more difficult to catch harp seal, which migrated up the west coast of Greenland every spring on the way from Canada. These hunts would have also been very well organized communal affairs, and that would have presumed a significant amount of collaboration between the settlements for survival. Well, the relationship between the Inuit and the Norse would have been strained and violent, but not all the time. There's also evidence of trade happening between the two groups. However, as resources dwindled, competition increased, and we do have archaeological evidence, including Norse skeletons with embedded arrowheads, suggesting violent encounters. Economic decline further weakened Norse Greenland. By the 14th century, European demand for walrus ivory collapsed because African elephant ivory became more available. And this is, in fact, I think, the main cause that led to the abandonment of the settlements. Walrus ivory would have been extremely important. We have, for example, a document from 1327 recording the shipment of a single boatload of tusks to Bergen in Norway, showing that that particular load with tusks from 260 whales, walruses, was worth more than all the cloth sent to the king by 4,000 Icelandic farms for 1 6-year period. So this is so that you can get an idea of the utmost importance of walrus ivory. So essentially, they were out of the market with this new evolution of African elephant ivory, and without this very important merchandise, it could not be sold anymore. That automatically meant that they were very much in danger of not making it. Additionally, the Norwegian crown also imposed a trade monopoly, so that meant that the ability of Greenland was restricted, so they couldn't trade independently. Fewer supply ships arrived, leaving the Norse increasingly self-reliant in an environment that really could not support them indefinitely. So it seems that the Western settlement would have disappeared by 1350, likely due to a combination of starvation, migration, and Inuit pressure. And the Eastern settlement struggled on for a couple of more decades. The last known written record is the wedding at Kvalsøy Church in 1402. When the later expeditions visited Greenland in the 16th century, 17th century, and later, they actually only found ruins. And this links quite well with the discoveries made on what is called in archaeological literature the farm beneath the sand. We don't really know the Norse name for this particular farm, but it seems to have been settled in the 11th century. And yeah, we have a central building on the farm, this small three-aisled hall, not unlike the halls we're more familiar with from the continent, like the ones in Gamla Uppsala or in Leire in Scandinavia. So it had everything from walls to benches and wooden posts holding up a turf roof and so on. There is evidence for cottage industry, so there were sheds for animals as well, and there is also evidence for textile industry. I mean by that the remains of an upright loom. The woven cloth also seems to have been of high quality and would have helped to keep the inhabitants of the farm well supplied. Mm, the farm beneath the sand was abandoned at some point around 1400, and this abandonment seems to have proceeded calmly and in a planned fashion. So there isn't really evidence of anything violent going on. Um, they left some of the animals behind, and this yeah is demonstrated by large quantities of manure. Anyway, the fate of this farm, has revealed by archaeology, confirms what one of the last Europeans to visit the Western settlement said about the experiences. I'm talking here about the priest Ivar Bardason. He records a journey made to the Eastern settlement as an administrator of the bishopric of Gardar, and he said that nothing was heard from the Western settlement in the mid 1300s. So in the Western settlements, eventually he found only half wild animals and abandoned farms. So no people. Yeah, there is a little discrepancy here regarding the dating, but at any rate, roughly speaking, by the year 1400, it would have been abandoned. And the last stop of our journey is North America. So by the late 10th century, the Norse of Greenland were pushing even further to the west. They were searching for resources. They were searching especially for timber. And the first known European to see North America was someone called Bjarni Herjolfsson, an Icelandic merchant. And it is told in the sources that he arrived on the coast around the year 986. And he was sailing to visit his father in Greenland when he was caught by a storm and blown off course. And after several days at sea, he spotted a distant wooded coastline. And according to the saga of the Greenlanders, he described seeing 3 distinct lands, but he did not go ashore, and instead he turned his ship northward and eventually did make it to Greenland, where he told people of his discovery. His description angered a bunch of people who told him that he was not brave enough to continue the exploration. Among them, Leif Erikson, so the son of Erik the Red, who bought Bjarni's ship and decided to go by himself and explore these new lands. He gathered a crew of 35 men, and he did reach the 3 lands previously seen by Bjarni. These lands would have been the land of flat stones called Helluland, rocky and barren with large flat stones and no vegetation. He said it was not suitable for settlement, and they continued south. We now believe that this was Baffin Island. The next land was heavily forested, thus the name forest lands or Markland would have been valuable since Greenland had almost no trees. They did cut down timber for later transport, but again, they did not stay. Modern identification with Labrador, and then Vinland, which has been translated multiple times as Wineland, the land of grapes, although the term might actually refer to something else, perhaps an undetermined type of berry. But yeah, generally speaking, it is considered to be the land of the grapes. So they reached this place of abundant wildlife, wild grapes or berries, and mild weather. And the sagas describe fertile soil, rivers full of salmon, trees for lumber, and yeah, they decided to settle there. So Leif and his men built the so-called Leif's búðir, so the booths of Leif, where they spent the winter. They returned to Greenland in the spring. They brought timber, furs, grapes, and other stuff. And then his brother Thorvald organized the next voyage, aiming to explore further and establish a larger settlement. Thorvald and his men wintered at the booth at the Leifsbúðir before exploring the surrounding coastline. And during the journey, they encountered the local indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrælingar. Not quite a clear term, but at any rate, it would have been something negative. They did not have any major conflicts at the beginning. However, Thorvald's crew killed a small group, possibly mistaking them for enemies, and the surviving Skrællingar soon returned with reinforcements and attacked the Norse settlement. So during this event, Thorvald was struck by an arrow and killed, and his men buried him in Vinland. The most serious Norse attempt at colonization was led by someone called Thorfinn Karlsefni, who would have been a wealthy Icelandic merchant. The sources actually disagree on this. It's the saga of Eric the Red, which tries to stage him as the most important character in the story. Unlike the previous expeditions, Karlsefni's voyage was intended to establish a long-lasting settlement. He had a crew of about 150 people, including men, women, livestock, and tools, as well as supplies for farming. Karlsefni's group expanded Leifsbudir. They began hunting, farming, fishing. At first, they traded peacefully with the Skrællingar, exchanging cloth, dairy products, iron tools for furs and other goods. But tensions escalated, and a major battle broke out between the two groups. So the Skrællingar, despite lacking iron weapons, they vastly outnumbered the Norse and used hit-and-run tactics to attack the settlements. Fearing continued attacks, Karlsefni's group actually abandoned the place, abandoned Vinland after 3 years, so 3 winters. They returned to Greenland. But during the expedition, Snorri Thorfinnsson was born, at least according to the sagas, and he would have been the first known European child born in North America. One very fascinating character you're going to find if you read the 2 Vinland sagas, so the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, is Frøydis Eiríksdóttir. She appears multiple times in these documents, and her story is very relevant for the whole atmosphere described here. The story has everything from treachery to ambition to courage and violence and so on. So she was the daughter of Eric the Red and the sister of Leif Erikson, and she is depicted differently in the sagas. So in the saga of Eric the Red, she is this fierce warrior woman, so the shield maiden, playing a critical role in defending the Norse against the Skrællingar. And then in the saga of the Greenlanders, she is portrayed very negatively and treacherous and violent, and she even organized the murder of one of her own expedition partners. So in the saga of the Greenlanders, Frøydis joins the expedition led by Helgi and Finnbogi, 2 other names in the story of colonization, and she convinces them to share a voyage to Vinland under an agreement that they would split the profits evenly. But upon arriving in Vinland, she betrays the brothers, she claims Leif's houses for herself, she forces the brothers to build separate quarters. Tensions grow between the parties. Frøydis devises a plan to kill Helgi and Finnbogi. She claims that the brothers beat her, which enrages her husband Thorvard, and that pushes him and their men to attack the camp of Finnbogi and Helgi at night. So all of them are tied up and executed, but Frøydis men refuse to kill the 5 women of the camp. At this point, Frøydis herself takes an axe and murders the women herself, ensuring no witnesses remain. After the massacre, she warns the crew never to speak of what happened, threatening them with death. And when she returns to Greenland, she bribes the crew with gifts to ensure their silence. However, some of their men confess to Leif Erikson, who is horrified, but refuses to punish his sister. Instead, he predicts that her descendants will amount to nothing. And indeed, that is the conclusion, that she and her lineage fall into disgrace. A very different role we have in the other saga, in Eiríks saga Rauða. Here we have the image of the shield maiden, the one who saves the Norse expedition from an indigenous attack. During the attack by the Skrællingar, the Norse panic, they start fleeing, and Frøydis, who is pregnant in the story, picks up a dead Norseman's sword, exposes her breasts, and slaps them with the blade while letting out a battle cry. And apparently the indigenous people who are so scared by this display of defiance that they actually retreat. So this version really tries to portray her in this heroic manner, contrasting sharply with the villainous description in the other saga. So we have such stories in the sagas of the Icelanders, mostly sometimes contrasting accounts, and this shows us the multiple lines of tradition we're operating with, oral traditions that would have been, also influenced by historical transmission, as well as political factors and so on. Whether she was or not a historical figure is unclear. Most likely not. Her actions are very much mythologized, I would also say quite stereotypical. But they also show the different tensions in society, and not only in society in the sense that the tensions between the indigenous people and the Norse, but also within the Norse society itself. So from this point of view, these stories are somewhat valuable. If we move to something more historical and documented, we should have a look at the site of Landsömedo. For centuries, the Vinland sagas described a Viking voyage to North America that was considered quite mythical. There was no physical evidence to confirm it. That changed in the 60s when Norwegian explorers Helge and Anne-Stine Ingstad discovered the site Landsömedo. They were searching for signs of Norse activity in North America when they arrived in Newfoundland. So they started asking around local fishermen and residents whether there were any strange ruins nearby, and eventually someone pointed towards some unusual mounds visible beneath the grass. And the excavation was a success because it revealed that these mounds were actually the remains of Norse-style buildings. And this actually made it the only proven Norse site in North America, at least until now. The key excavation findings, well, we have 8 buildings about 200 meters inland. There is also evidence of ironworking and boat repair, and artifacts linking the site to Iceland and Greenland, and also remains of woodworking and shipbuilding activities. The construction style very similar to structures found in Iceland and Greenland, and that would have confirmed that they were built by Viking settlers. We have the largest building measuring approximately 29 meters in length. The main hall here, the Norse would have lived, worked, and gathered. There's evidence for sleeping areas, a central fire pit, storage rooms as well. So very typical of Norse chieftain halls. Another section of the site contained a smithy where bog iron was smelted into nails and tools. This is actually a very significant discovery because it is the only known pre-Columbian ironworking site in the Americas. So the Norse produced here iron rivets for ship repair, for example, and that would support the theory that the site would have also been a staging ground for further exploration. And then we also have evidence for several smaller buildings, apparently used for storage, boat repair. They were known for repairing their boats while overwintering, and that would have ensured that they were seaworthy for the return voyage to Greenland. Woodworking tools, iron nails. This suggests that the Norse might have been maintaining ships at the site. A spindle whorl was also discovered, as well as some other tool markings, wooden debris, a bronze ring pin, even a stone oil lamp, as well as bones of animals, so seals, for example, or cod, as well as some traces of barley. However, if we look at the whole picture, the occupation and artifacts suggest that this wasn't really this was not meant as a permanent settlement, like a permanent colony, but rather as a seasonal base camp for further voyages to North America. This came to nothing, unfortunately. There was lack of farming. The Norse relied on farming in their settlements, but no signs of field or anything suggesting livestock farming was found here. So it apparently was used for only about 5 years in total. At any rate, less than 10 years, and the focus would have been on ship repair and apparently on using it as some form of a starting point for further exploration. The Vinland sagas do suggest that the Norse traveled farther south, but this remains debated. And we also have a different problem, which is that these grapes, to which the name Vinland would allude, were actually found further south, in areas where grapes grow naturally. So this might not be Vinland, or perhaps the name Vinland means something completely different. In the course of history, there have been multiple attempts to identify artifacts with Viking presence in America. A lot of these are unfortunately hoaxes. The so-called main penny, on the other hand, seems to have been to truly have been a Norwegian coin from about 1060 to 1080, and this was discovered at a American site at Goddard Point near the mouth of Pemscot Bay in Maine, and it was found in, let's say, acceptable archaeological settings. According to the prevailing theory, though, the coin was not transported south by the Norse themselves. Instead, the coin likely traveled from the Dorset Eskimos of northern Labrador through northern Indians to the Indians of Maine. So this is one example of one object that could have been from the Norse themselves. However, we do have hoaxes as well, such as the Kensington runestone. This is something discovered by a Swedish immigrant in the 19th century in Minnesota, initially hailed as the ultimate evidence that Vikings had reached North America. The stone was inscribed with runes telling the story of a group of 8 people from Götaland, from Sweden, and 22 people from Norway traveling inland from the site of Vinland in 1362, encountering all kinds of dangers during their journey. And the inscription would have also included a Latin phrase. It was dubious from the very beginning. The runes appear unusually clear and sharp for an ancient artifact, very little erosion, which is very uncommon, and then the style of the runes was also distinctive, being very neat and more precise than your typical runestone, and also Arabic numerals were used, and that would have been an anomaly for the time. In the meantime, linguistic analysis was done on this runestone, and it clearly revealed that the language used here is far closer to modern Swedish than medieval Norse, with a lot of anachronistic phrases and a lack of old grammatical forms that would have been present in 14th century Swedish. So this would mean that the runestone, the farthest runestone, remains the runestone from Greenland, from the site of Kingitorsuaq. This is also an interesting one, more interesting than the Kensington one, in my opinion. It says something about Erlinger, the son of Sigvard, and Bjarni, the son of Thord, and Einri, the son of Odd, constructing the cairns the Saturday before Rogation Day. This is the standard translation from the rune data. It's quite unclear what is meant here, especially due to the fact that there are also symbols used that don't look like runes at all, and the last part of the inscription is quite unclear. But we can remember it as the runestone which we can find the furthest to the west. So now at the end of the presentation, just a book recommendation. If you want to read more about that, I would recommend to you A History of the Vikings by Gwyn Jones. It's quite a bulky book. It's from 2001, the last edition. So yeah, it may not contain the latest archaeological studies, but at any rate, it's quite comprehensive and quite pleasant to read. Contains a lot of interesting details. And if you are into runes and runestones, you can always use the um, Skaldic database as well as the rune data. I will gladly add these sites in the comment section on my YouTube video. And speaking of my YouTube, you can find many videos detailing some of the topics I discussed today. Like I said, I have one about navigation in the Viking Age, and I also have an interesting one about the Christianization of Iceland, for example. And I also intend to do more videos on the Viking Age in the future as well. So feel free to explore my YouTube channel as well. So thank you so much for listening or for watching, and see you next time.